The topic is Apoha and Navya-Nyaya, exclusion from others in a realist guise. I came across this topic only recently. It ties up with some work which I had done before. I had once published something about double negation in Navya-Nyaya. And it occurred to me that one of these double negations in Navya-Nyaya is just like Apoha, what you know from Buddhist philosophy. So Apoha, this is the theory that words convey meaning by exclusion of others. And there is something very similar in Navya-Nyaya, because exclusion of others, this is an expression which involves two negations. And the basic idea of the Buddhist nominalists is that the meaning of the word cow is just the exclusion of all non-cows, so to say. So very broadly, one can say for the Buddhists, X is a cow if and only if X is not a non-cow. And in Navya-Nyaya, we see also great interest in these double negations, but they express the double negations in a very peculiar way. They talk about relational absences and mutual absences. Sometimes these terms are also just rendered as absence and difference. So we have basically two kinds of negations, absence and difference. And of course, when you have two negations, then you have four possibilities how to combine them. And one of these four possible combinations corresponds to an apoha. And it's the absence of the difference, or the relational absence of the mutual absence, one can also say. And it occurred to me, this is just like apoha. Actually, I was not the first one who saw it like this. Only when I prepared my talk, I came across an article by Mark Sideritz. It's a contribution to a collective volume on apoha, which I can recommend very much. It's edited by Tillemans, Sideritz, and Chakrabarti. The title is just Apoha. And there I found this article by Mark Sideritz. And actually only on the last pages of this article, Mark Sideritz refers also to this peculiar combination of absences in Navya-Nyaya, which looks like Apoha, absence of difference. And well, there are some other combinations. As I've said, we have all in all four. And I wanted to find out in what way they differ from each other. Can we reduce them to something simpler? In the case of absence of difference, it's possible. The absence of the difference from an F is just F-ness. This is what many Navya-Nyayikas tell us. And F-ness, this can be a universal. And of course, the universal fulfills in Navya-Nyaya just the function which in Buddhist philosophy is fulfilled by apoha. So that's why we can call this combination of absences an apoha-like combination, we can say. The problematic point is now that some Navya-Nyayikas say that this combination, which is apoha-like, has a kind of double nature. One could say that the absence of the difference from an F is F-ness. Then it would be very much like apoha, fulfills the same function which apoha fulfills in Buddhist philosophy. But some Navya-Nyayikas say also that the absence of the difference from an F is F. And Maturanata even tries to prove this very formally. Sideritz also renders this argument in his article. And actually, the argument is already given in a much older publication, namely in this very old book by Ingalls from 1951, Materials of the Study of Navya-Nyaya Logic. There you find the argument also. And Ingalls has the idea, the argument seems to be okay. Yeah? So why should the absence of the difference from an F not be F? It might also be Fness. There's also good reason to think it's Fness. But the argument given by Maturanata seems to be also okay. Yeah? And Sideritz in his article also seems to buy it. Yeah? And in my talk now, I will try to give you a very formal framework in which we can prove that the absence of the difference from an F is actually Fness and not F. Yeah? It cannot be both. Otherwise, Fness would be F, and that would be a total disaster. Yeah? Then you would have something like potness is a pot. Yeah? This cannot happen. Yeah? So both cannot be true. Only one can be true. And it's actually the identity, the absence of the difference from an F is Fness. And my formal framework in which I can prove this formally will also give you a reason why this other alternative identity must be wrong. Yeah? There is a defect in the argument, and I will pinpoint this defect also. So that's what we are going to do in this talk. And this is basically also explained here in the introduction. We can move on to the next slide also. So here I want to explain a little bit what apoha is. Yeah? This is a theory which explains the relation between word and meaning. Yeah? The apoha doctrine was designed by Ninaga, the founder of a logico-epistemological branch of Buddhist philosophy, the so-called Yogacara Sautrantika. And apoha means exclusion. The apoha theory is a way to explain the relation between word and meaning nominalistically. Let us take the example of a particular kind of tree, and I quote here from Hattori. Hattori's article is also in this collective volume, which is entitled Apoha. So let's read Hattori's explication of apoha. Let us take the example of a particular kind of tree. People may use the word kadira to refer to it by terms such as tree, vriksha, substance, dravya, earthy, partiva, or existent, sat. These words all refer to the same object. In other words, they merely refer to one aspect among the various properties of the object, such as kadiraness, treeness, and substanceness. We can take the next slide. If words referred to the object itself, this would mean either that the various words applied to the same object were all synonyms, or that the object denoted by these various words was one and yet had many distinct realities. Therefore, the function of the word is deemed to consist solely in differentiating the referent from other things. The word tree, vriksha, functions solely to differentiate the object from non-trees, avriksha. And there does not exist any real entity corresponding to this word. Thus, the gist of Dignaga's apoha theory is that the word does no more than denote the object through the exclusion of others, anya apoha, anya vyavacheda, anya vyavrti, or denote that portion, angsha, bhaga, of the object that is differentiated from other things. So that's basically apoha, yeah? The exclusion of others. So the word cow does not denote a cow or the set of cows. It denotes the exclusion of non-cows. Okay. So then we can take the next slide. Now we get the side of the story which is told by the Nayayikas, the enemies of the Buddhists. They are realists, and they give us another picture. According to the Nyaya explanation for the relation between word and meaning, the meaning of a learnable common noun comprises two aspects, namely reference, shakya, and sense, shakyata vachedaka. The reference of a word, such as, for example, tree, is each particular tree. The universal treeness, which functions as the sense, explains how the word tree can distributively refer to each tree. Neither the bare particular nor the pure universal is the primary meaning of a word. It is the balanced view that the meaning of a word is a particular possessing a general property, something serving as the common mode of presentation of its unlimited number of reference. So what a common noun like tree refers to is a tree in combination with the universal. So we skipped one slide. This is slide 4. Can we go back to this? Slide 4. The fourth one. And then we have to move to 5. Slide 5. There's something. Ah, yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yeah, this one. Still have to add something to the APOA theory. The motivation behind the APOA theory is the idea that the only real things are unique particulars, svalakshana. According to Denaga, there is no mind-independent property or set of properties which all trees have in common and which grounds our way of referring to them by means of a single unifying concept. Unlike his main opponents, the realist Nayayikas, the adherents of one of the Brahmanical systems in classical Indian philosophy, Denaga holds that universals have no ontological footing. However, and I quote here from Sideritz, if the particular is truly unique, then the complement, the class of things distinct from that particular, will consist of just that particular itself. We get nowhere by invoking two negations. If I say X is not a non-cow, this is practically tautological. I could also say X is a cow instead. Yeah? It's somehow circular if I express it with these two negations. The literature on Buddhist philosophy abounds in attempts to defend the theory of Apoha against the obvious charge of circularity. But this will not concern us in the present talk. If you want to hear more about this, then I would strongly recommend this collective volume to you entitled Apoha. So now we can move to slide number 7. I have to introduce 7. This is this is it. I have to introduce now the Nyaya system of ontological categories. Many of you will be familiar with this, but if there is someone among you who does not know these things, then it's good to hear it again. So in the late era of the development of the system, Nayayikas assigned every entity in the universe to one or another of the following 7 categories. We have, first of all, substance, dravya. The 9 traditional substances are earth, water, fire, wind, ether, time, space, soul, and mind. Substance is the only category whose members enter into a relation of contact. And we have to hear more about this. Composite substances consisting of earth, water, fire, or wind inhere in their parts, and inherence is a special type of relation. I will come back to it. The irreducible constituents of composite substances are the atoms corresponding to each of these elements. Souls and minds are also conceived of as impartite. Time and space are both one, but they are conceptually divided into moments, kshana, and space points, pradesha, respectively. We can take the next one. Quality, guna. The 24 traditional qualities inhere only in substances. Qualities like color, taste, scent, and so on inhere in the material substances. Qualities like pleasure, pain, knowledge, and so on inhere in the soul. Some qualities, such as number and contact, yoga, inhere in all 9 kinds of substance. It should be noted that contact is, like inherence, a relational category. It conjoins entities which have been separate before and which subsides when the conjoined entities are moved apart. Every pair of individuals which are in contact is characterized by its own contact. So there are many contacts, but there is only one inherence. We have to come back to this relation later. And this inherence links also a contact to the entities which are conjoined via contact. Since contacts are also qualities, they have to be related by some kind of relation to their substrates. And this connecting relation is the inherence. Then motion. Motion is divided into 5 types, namely upward motion, downward motion, contraction, expansion, and going or any movement which does not come under the above 4. Like qualities, they inhere only in substances. All this might occur to you to be a bit archaic and primitive, but actually even the Navya-Nayayikas were all in all quite conservative. And conservative Navya-Nayayikas stick to this system of categories. There are exceptions, though, and one important exception is Raghunatha Shiromani. He saw some defects in this system and he tried to revise it also. One can say even completely. So let's take the next slide. Universal, jati or samanya. In non-Nyaya Sanskrit, jati often means class or genus, but in Nyaya, jati is not the genus itself, but that characteristic by which the genus is recognized in the individual. The jati of a horse is horseness. This is not the class of all horses in the sense in which class is used in common speech. Universals inhere in substances, qualities, and motions. And then we have the individuator, also known as ultimate difference, in Sanskrit Vishesha. An individuator is that entity residing in an atom in virtue of which that atom is different from other atoms. The reason for recognizing individuator as a category was this. Entities differ because their parts differ. The smallest parts are the atoms. Since these are indivisible, they cannot differ as do other entities by difference of their parts. Accordingly, they were said to differ because of ultimate differences residing in them. And then we can take the next slide. Inherence, samavaya. We have heard about this before. Now let's explicate it in detail. Inherence is that in virtue of which substances are related to their parts, qualities and actions to substances, and universals to substances, qualities, and motions. It is supposed to account for the occurrence and coalescence of different and ontologically distinct word constituents within concrete things. So we have ontologically distinct word constituents like qualities and substances, and they are integrated, qualities are integrated with substances by means of inherence. Inherence integrates inseparable entities, and in that way it's different from contact. A universal, for example, is inseparably conjoined with a substance as its substrate via inherence. Thus, fireness inheres in every fire, and it occurs only as an inherer of a fire as its inheree. Free-floating universals don't exist. So then let's take the next one. This will be very important for this talk. The category absence, which you don't have in early Nyaya, but in later Nyaya you have it. And also the Navya-Nayayikas assumed it as a category. Absence, abhava. An absence is a negative entity, but it is nevertheless real. Something which the Buddhists, of course, would never have accepted. Absence is twofold, namely mutual absence anyonya abhava, and relational absence, sangsarga abhava. In order to illustrate these absences, we can refer to the example of an empty pot. Since the pot is different from a cloth, it is a locus of the mutual absence, anyonya abhava, of or the difference, veda, from the cloth. Since there is no food in the pot, we assumed that the pot is empty, it is also a locus of the absence of food. This is another type of negative property. It is called relational absence, sangsarga abhava, since this property characterizes a locus as being unrelated to the absentee, that which is absent, in terms of one of the relations enunciated in the Nyaya system of ontological categories. Since food has no contact, sangyoga, with the pot, the latter is a locus of the absence of food having contact with the pot. Then we can take the next slide. The specification of the relation whereby an absentee fails to reside in a locus was regarded as crucial. Although potness resides in the pot via inherence, samavaya, we have heard that universals reside in their substrates by means of inherence. Although potness resides in a pot via inherence, a pot is a locus of the relational absence of potness having contact with the pot. So, in a certain way, potness is also absent from a pot when we talk about the relation contact, because potness is not in contact with the pot. It inheres the pot. So that's why it's very important to specify always the relation of an absence also. A mutual absence or difference is construed as a denial of a further type of action, of relation, namely identity, tadatnya. We will also come back to this. If something is a locus of the mutual absence of a pot, for example, it is not identical to any pot. So that's why one can say that a mutual absence is construed as a denial of an identity. Commonly, Nayayikas subdivide relational absence into three varieties by taking into account three possibilities of an absence's temporal expansion. Let's take the next slide then. So we have first of all prior absence, prag abhava. This is the beginningless absence of a thing somewhere before it is created. Then we have posterior absence, dvangsa abhava. This is the everlasting absence of a thing somewhere after it has been destroyed. And C, absolute absence, atyanta abhava. As suggested by its name, type C refers to cases of an absence whose absentee never occurs in a particular locus, such as the absence of color in the air. There is no color in the air, according to this system of ontological categories. Sometimes the so-called temporary absence, samayika abhava, is added as a fourth type. It includes impermanent absences, such as the absence of a pot during its temporary removal from the ground. Anambhata treats temporary absence as a subcategory of absolute absence. Of course, one might think this is not very fortunate to do it like that, but the Nayayikas try to devise some arguments which can make it plausible somehow, to regard also these temporary absences as absolute absences. But this subdivision of relational absences into A, B, and C is irrelevant in the present context, and we will hereafter often refer to relational absences just as absences and to mutual absences as differences, because these two expressions are used interchangeably, mutual absence and difference. So from now on, I will very often just talk about absence and difference, where absence means relational absence and difference means mutual absence. So then we can take the next slide. Navianayakas often take into account an additional type of relation, namely the so-called self-linking relation. Swarupa Sambandha. This is the relation which integrates absences and their substrates. The Navianayakas thought this cannot be a contact, this can also not be an inherence. It must be something else. However, in contrast to contact and inherence, a self-linking relation is like the above-mentioned identity, a merely supposed relation, not a separate entity over and above the relata. Some of the Navianayakas had the feeling we don't want to assume too much in our system of ontological categories. We don't want to admit too much. If we have just contact and inherence, they are real entities, that's enough. But the others, the other relations must be there also somehow, because for them it didn't make much sense to say that an abhava, for instance, is in contact with something or adheres in something. But they are rather conceptual devices. Self-linking relations conjoin also the so-called imposed properties, upadi, with their substrates. What is this? An imposed property looks like a universal, insofar as it is also referred to by means of an abstract noun, such as, for instance, earthness and hotness, and these refer to genuine universals. But this is not a genuine universal in Upadi. The meanings of a large number of general terms in our language are construed as upadis, that is, nominal properties, not objective universals. Kannada and Prashastapada, two of the masterminds of this system of ontological categories, did not really address this issue. It was above all Udayana who tried to provide a set of criteria for the exclusion of invalid or counterfeit universals, such as pugness, pachakatva, or being an inhabitant of Ayodhya, Ayodhya Vasitva. So these abstract names, they look like names for universals, but if we admit that these are also universals, then we get a plethora of universals, and it's just too much. And the Nayakas wanted to be as economic as possible. Some nominal properties are like the letter, like Ayodhya Vasita, for instance, compound, whereas universals should be elementary. And Udayana notes 6 other invalidating factors, Jati Badaka. Invalidating factor means a factor which accounts for the fact that something only looks like a universal, but is not really a universal. So then we can take the next slide. Now, I said in my introduction that the absence of the difference, that this is a kind of apoha. For the Buddhist, the purpose of apoha is to offer an explanation for the relation between word and meaning, which renders universals obsolete. Words convey meaning by exclusion of others. The exclusion of others merely masquerades as a universal. The realist Navianayakas anchor the meaning of a term F to the property Fness. Nevertheless, they were able to express a kind of a reification of the exclusion of all non-Fs in the sense of the property of being not a non-F by means of their 2 types of absences. So let's assume that this property, the property of being not a non-F, this is a kind of reification of apoha, of the exclusion of all non-Fs. And how can we express this by means of these 2 absences? First of all, we can say X is not a non-F if and only if X is not a locus of the difference from an F. I think this equivalence is quite evident. X is not a non-F if and only if X is not a locus of the difference from an F. Hence, the property of being not a non-F should be the property of being no locus of the difference from an F. So we just transform both sides of this equivalence. X is not a non-F, and X is not a locus of the difference from an F. We transform these 2 sides of the equivalence into properties. And then we get the property of being not a non-F is the property of being no locus of the difference from an And now it makes sense to say that the property of being no locus of the difference from an f is just the absence of the difference from an f. Because wherever there is this property of being no locus of the difference from an f, there is the absence of the difference from an f, and also vice versa. Okay. So it seems that this combination of absences is really somehow apoha-alike. Thus, the absence of the difference from an f can reasonably be regarded as an apoha-like combination of absences, although Navya-Nayakas do not refer to it as apoha. When the Navya-Nayakas were flourishing, Buddhism was basically dead. Many Navya-Nayakas agree that it can be equated with the f-ness. That is, they regard the absence of the difference from an f as a mere circumlocution of f-ness. The former expression can be reduced to the latter as a logically equivalent one. We will now produce a logical framework in which this reduction rule can be formally proved. So now it becomes a bit technical. A logical framework for a formal reconstruction of the Navyanya logic of property and location. The present attempt to model the Navyanya logic of property and location in general is based on George Wheeler's calculus T1 plus property adaptations of the axioms of the Ackermann set theory, except for the axiom of extensionality. We will now give a brief introduction to the property theory T1 and to its Ackermann-style extension. So this is a logical framework which is useful for studying arguments in Navyanyaya which are related to properties in general. But we will specifically use it for proving now that the absence of the difference from an f is f-ness and not f. So first of all, George Wheeler's property calculus T1. T1 is equipped with a means to represent property abstraction. If A of x is a first order formula in which x occurs free, we write A of x in square brackets x for being an x such that x is A. This is how we read this. A of x, x, A of x in square brackets with subscript. X means being an x such that x is A. And we can also read this as A-ness. So we have a means here for representing property terms. And that's very useful, of course, because the Navyanayakas always talk about things like spotness and treeness, and we must have a means to represent this formally. We have this in George Wheeler's property calculus T1. Relational abstraction can be expressed in a similar way. If R is a binary relation, we write XRY with subscripts x and y for being an x and a y such that x is related to y by R. And we can also read this as R-ness. So we can now formalize something like causeness, effectness, for instance, also things which the Navyanayakas talk about all the time. This kind of notation is something which might remind you of something else when you have studied logic. We can now go to slide 19. No, this is 19, is what we must have now. A little bit before that. Yeah, that's it. So Wheeler's square bracket notation with subscripted binding variables is a variant of the notation for lambda terms in lambda calculus. So in lambda calculus, we have something very similar. Instead of these square brackets, you use just the lambda. And instead of the subscript, you say just x after lambda. And then it's practically the same. But the meaning of a lambda term is a little bit different. And I explain this here also. However, Wheeler's property terms should not be regarded as extensional or intensional descriptions of functions. A lambda term denotes a function, actually. It can be, mostly it's an extensional function, can also be in some cases an intensional one. But the reason why I like Wheeler's calculus so much is that he regards properties as intentional metaphysical objects. Therefore, his approach has much in common with the reification of properties in Navyanyaya. So in Wheeler's calculus, the reference of these property terms are really things. And that's what I need. I need a system where properties are regarded as things, not as functions. So that's why I have been sticking to Wheeler's formalization methods for many, many years now. As far as I can see, it's the best one can get for formalizing arguments in Navyanyaya. So then let's take the next slide. It's 20. Yeah. Although Wheeler does not identify properties with functions, functions do play a role in the construction of its semantic framework. Wheeler basically thinks, and he writes this also in his book, Quality and Concept, that everything which you can do normally with functions and so on, which traditional logicians like to do in many, many other ways, especially by relying on functions, all this can be done also by means of properties. But when he tries to specify the meaning of property terms, for instance, he takes into account, again, functions. And how does this fit together? He argues for this. However, these meta-theoretic constructions may be viewed as only a convenient shorthand for a meta-theoretic construction within a property-theoretic framework. So he takes the use of functions in his semantic framework just as a kind of shorthand, one can say. It's still practical to have it, but actually from a metaphysical standpoint, it's much more natural to take into account only properties, because properties, this is something which is real somehow, but functions, this is only conceptual. In T1, property terms are interpreted in general via functions which assign to each property in the domain of an algebraic model structure an actual extension as well as alternative possible extensions. Thus, it is possible for a property's contingent instances to be different from what they actually are. Wheeler doesn't use the concept of possible worlds here, but one could use it actually, but it's not necessary to have it. We can just talk about actual extensions and alternative possible extensions. If you like, you can also say extensions in other possible worlds than the actual world. Now, the full axiomatization of T1 can be proved to be sound and complete. Then we can take the next slide. We have, first of all, truth functional tautologies. This is A1. Then we have A2. This is also something you know from first order logic for all VI. A of VI implies A of T, where T is free for VI in A. That is, no free occurrence of VI in A lies within the scope of a quantifier or a sequence of index variables in a term, square brackets, subscripts V1 up to Vn, which would bind a variable occurring in T. So not only quantifiers can bind in this system, but of course the index variables of a property term can also bind. One has to take this into account. Yeah? So when one wants to explain what is a free variable, what is a variable which is free for another term, then one should take this into account. Then A3, also something you are familiar with from first order logic for all VI. A implies B implies A implies for all VI B. So one can shift the quantifier of a universally generalized implication to the consequent. But this is only possible if VI is not free in A. Then we have axioms for identity. VI is equal to VI. Then A5, VI equal to VJ implies A of VI VI equivalent to A of VI VJ. And here A of VI VJ is a formula which arises from A of VI VI, by replacing some, but not necessarily all, free occurrences of Vi by Vj. And Vj is free for the occurrences of Vi that it replaces. So A4 and A5 are axioms for identity, which you also know from first order logic, maybe. Then we can go to the next slide. Now we get special axioms for the property terms. A U1 up to UP is unequal to B V1 up to VQ, where P unequal to Q. Makes also some more sense if we have two property terms, but they have different numbers of subscripted variables, then the terms cannot be identical. The arity of the relations is different, one could say. A P-ary relation cannot be identical to a Q-ary relation if P is unequal to Q. So then A7, A of U1 up to UP, subscripted variables U1 up to UP is equal to A of V1 up to VP, subscripted variables V1 up to VP, where these two terms are alphabetic variants. This is also clear. Then A8, and this is now a very important axiom because it gives us a criterion for the identification of property terms. A subscripted variables U1 up to UP is equal to B subscripted variables U1 up to UP, if and only if necessary that for all U1 up to for all UP, A equivalent B. So in the case of property terms, identity means necessary equivalence, one could say. Okay, identity means necessary equivalence. Then we have A9, necessary that A implies A. This is also an axiom which you might be familiar with from modal logic. Then we have A10, necessary that A implies B implies necessary that A implies necessary that B. Also a very fundamental axiom from modal logic. And we have A11, possible that A implies necessary that possible that A. Now, this is an important axiom in the modal calculus S5. Then we have three rules. If A is a theorem and A implies B is a theorem, then B is a theorem. This is the modus ponens rule. Modus ponens from propositional logic. Then we have R2, the rule from first order logic, generalization rule. If A is a theorem, then for all VI, A. And then we have R3 from modal logic, the necessitation rule. If A is a theorem, then necessary that A is a theorem. So this is T1. And then we can take the next slide, where I just repeat what I've explained already, what kind of axioms we have here. First of all, we have A1 up to A5, along with R1 and R2. R1 was modus ponens, R2 generalization rule. These constitute an axiomatization of first order predicate logic, including identity. We have two identity axioms also. Then we have A6 up to A8. These are special axioms for the intensional abstracts in T1. A9 up to A11 and R3. This is the modal part of the axiomatic system S5 of propositional modal logic. It should be noted here that the semantic model structure of T1 is very different from that of ordinary modal systems. Bieler treats modalities as predicates applied to propositions, which he formalizes by means of his square bracket notation for properties. In contrast to property terms, terms for propositions have no index variables. Thus, A in square brackets is a proposition expressing that A. So A without index variables, this is the proposition. An expression of the form, it is necessary that A, box A, is adopted as a convenient abbreviation of expressions such as necessary that A. This is how we can read this, and is now a one-place predicate expressing it is necessary. And that A, this is just this term in square brackets. This is quite interesting because this allows Bieler to include in his system lots of modalities. The modalities are now just predicates. If you want to express something like A knows that P, then you can take knows as a two-place predicate. And A is one of the arguments, and that P is the other argument. And then we don't need special modal operators, which we have normally in epistemic logic, for instance. You can include everything you want in this system. You can include alethic modal logic, you can include epistemic logic, you can include deontic logic, just in this way, just by treating the modalities as predicates. This is quite interesting. And that's why we must be a little bit careful when we read something like box A in this system. This is not to be understood in the ordinary sense. It means something different. It means necessary that A. It's just a shorthand. So then we can take the next slide. I want to come back here to this axiom A8, which tells us something about the identification of properties. So that identity of properties means necessary equivalence of the predicates from which the properties are abstracted. So A8 is a kind of counterpart of the axiom of extensionality in set theory. Axiom of extensionality tells us under what condition two classes are identical. They must have the same members. Okay. So A8 captures the idea that for property terms, identity is tantamount to necessary equivalence. And Navya Nayakas were well aware that the extensional equivalence of two predicates is not a sufficient condition for the identification of the property terms which are abstracted from these predicates. So it's not enough to say, let's say two properties have the same instances, they occur in the same loci, one can say. That's not enough for to say that that the properties are identical. There must be something more to it. We must have the necessary equivalence of the predicates from which the properties are abstracted. And the Navya-Nayakas were quite aware of something like that. This is what I explain here also. Thus, the Navya-Nayakas did not equate properties like being created, and being non-eternal, anityatva, although the class of everything which is created and the class of all non-eternal entities were regarded as identical. Similarly, knowability, jneyatva, and nameability, apideyatva, were conceived of as both universal, and they occur everywhere, but nevertheless distinct properties. They are still distinct. So that's why we should be careful. We should not regard these properties as kind of classes or so. Because even if they have the same instances, if they occur in the same loci, they might still be different. Because we can also think about possible worlds, for instance, in which something which is created is eternal. After it has been made, it exists forever. We can think about something like that. But in the actual world, it's not like that. In the actual world, wherever there is the property being created, there's also the property non-eternal. So then let's take the next slide. These axioms which I have presented are not enough for proving something like the absence of the difference from an F is Fness, which would actually justify to call this combination of absences a kind of apoha, because if it's identical to Fness, it has the same function as the apoha. In Nyaya, it's the Fness, which is the reason why we call something an F. So it has the same function as apoha. In Buddhism, it's apoha, which gives us the reason why we call something a cow. But if we want to prove such an identity, the absence of the difference from an F is Fness, then we need a little bit more than these axioms, which I have introduced. And actually, Bieder also tries to extend his system a little bit, but he does it for the purpose of getting a system in which you can do mathematics. So In order to adapt T1 to the purpose of providing an axiomatic basis for mathematics, Bieler adds property versions of the axioms of well-known set-theoretic systems, such as ZF, Zermelo-Fraenkel, NBG, Neumann-Bernard-Gödel, or MK. And he adds them to the axioms of T1. Instead of a property version of the axiom of extensionality, there is A8 in these extensions of T1. Of course, we cannot add a kind of axiom of extensionality to our system, because we have just seen properties are not classes. And we want to identify two properties, we need something stricter than extensionality. So we can forget about that here, but we need some kind of other set theoretic axioms, or something which is at least an analog to such axioms. And we can get this just by translating the axioms of set theory into property axioms. We can do this. And the translation of the axioms of set theory into property theoretic axioms is carried out in the following way. Class terms like the class of all x, such that A of x, are replaced by the property term A of xx. X is such that A of x. Being an x such that A of x. Moreover, Bieler introduces a predication relation, delta, which functions as a counterpart of the element relation in set theory. So in set theory, we can have something like A is an element of the class of all x, such that A of x, and instead of element, we have now delta. And we get expressions like A delta, A of xx, and this means now A possesses or is a locus or an instance of the property being an x such that A is true of x. This is how we have to read this. So delta means possesses, or is a locus of, or is an instance of. This is how we read this. Something can be a locus of a property, or an instance of a property, or it can possess a property. And in all the axioms of set theory, except for the axiom of extensionality, we carry out such a translation. Then we can take the next slide. But now the question is, of course, we have many systems of set theory, and which one should we choose? They are all a little bit different. For the purpose of modeling logical inquiries concerning particulars, like pots, mountains, and so on, elements have to be taken into account into the targeted hybrid system. So normally in set theory, we talk only about sets, or maybe classes. But we can also create systems where we include something like concrete objects, like pots, mountains, and whatever. And we need such a system as well when we want to model arguments about properties and locations in Naviania, because Navianians talk about these things. Moreover, since Navianians posited the existence of universal properties, such as, for example, nameability, the extension of T1 has to be patterned after a set theoretic system, which, unlike ZF, warrants the existence of proper classes. Very broadly, one can say proper classes are something very, very big. Something like the universal class, for instance, the class of all sets. In Zermelo-Fraenkel, for instance, you cannot talk about such a thing. Cannot even talk about it. But in Naviania, you have something similar to the universal class, and this is the property nameability. Everything is nameable. And since the Navianians talk very much about such properties as well, we need a system where you can do that. And such a system cannot be patterned after ZF. We need a system which warrants the existence of such properties which are like proper classes. But we have this also. We have systems like NBG or MK. MK stands for Morse-Kelly, by the way. NBG, Neumann-Bernard-Gödel, and MK is Morse-Kelly. And these are both systems where you can talk about such very big classes like the universal class, for instance. In an NBG or MK-like system with elements, the property analogs of such proper classes, which we call properly class-like properties, like nameability, for instance, can be proved to exist. However, since Navianians posit the existence of the universal property nameability, nameability-ness should likewise exist. And this is actually something which you can find in Navier texts. When you create property abstracts, you can always add another ness, and again another ness. Yeah, you can have nameability-ness, nameability-ness-ness, nameability-ness-ness-ness, and so on and so on. There is no limit to that. Yeah, they never tell you that there is a limit to that. And that's also why we can say that Nayakas are not committed, or especially Navier Nayakas now, are not committed to be finitistic. They can talk about infinite universes also. Just also because we can always take an abstract property and add as many nesses as we like. Okay. So since Navier Nayakas posit the existence of the universal property nameability, nameability-ness should likewise exist. It is a property which is unique to nameability and can be regarded as a property analog of the singleton of the universal class. This is the class of all sets. And now we get some kind of objects which we even don't have in Neumann Berners Gödel anymore, and also not in Morse-Kelly anymore. We are then committed also to accept nameability-ness, and this would be an analog of the singleton of V. And this would be a further existing property, and so on and so on. So we need another system than NVG or MK, on which we can model the Navier logic of property and location. But we have something like that as well. We will see. By the way, the property being a natural number is also the analog of a class of proper classes if we define natural numbers according to a Bilerian specification of the Navier so-called circumtaining concept of number, and I've published on this. However, the corresponding classes do not even exist in NBG or NK. So what kind of system would be useful for us? Yeah. Instead of property versions of the axioms of ZF, NBG, or MK, we add property versions of the axioms of the Ackermann set theory, including foundation and urelements. So this system was created by Ackermann in the 1950s. He published also an article on it, and it's also explained in a book by Frankel, Bar Hillel, and Levy. There's also an article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about alternative set theories, and there you have also an exposition of this set theory, which was created by Ackermann, the Ackermann set theory. So we will add the axioms of the Ackermann set theory to T1, or rather translations into property axioms. We can prove the same theorems about sets in the Ackermann set theory as in Zermelo-Frankel. This has been shown. Moreover, the Ackermann set theory also warrants the existence of proper classes, and it even warrants the existence of the power set of V and the n-fold, even the n-fold power set of V for any natural number n. So we have also something like the singleton of the universal class, the singleton of universal class, whatever we like. Therefore, a property analog of the Ackermann set theory is ideally suited to the purpose of providing a logical framework for proving intuitions about properties in the Navier logic of property and location. And the following property versions of the axioms of the Ackermann set theory, excluding extensionality, have to be added to T1 in order to obtain the targeted hybrid system, which I will call T1A hereafter. So this is T1 plus these new axioms, which we get now on the new slide. So we can move on. We have only 4 axioms. In the Ackermann set theory, there's also a 5th, which is extensionality, which we don't need. We don't need extensionality because we have axiom A8, which is our criterion for identifying properties. We need especially alpha asterisk here. This is a comprehension axiom for class-like properties. What is a class-like property? I'm not sure whether I have explained this. 28. maybe I do it now. We can take 28. Can take 28. What we just had. Yeah, the one before. Right, the one. Right, that's the one. Yeah. So in set theory, we distinguish between classes and sets. Every set is also a class, but not vice versa. Not every class is a set. And in ordinary systems like Neumann-Berners-Gödel or Zermedo-Frankel, we have only sets in Neumann-Berners-Gödel. We have sets and classes. In Morse-Kelley, we have also sets and classes. And in Morse-Kelley and Neumann-Berners-Gödel, every element of a class is a set. Every element of a class is a set. This is what characterizes sets, actually. Sets are also classes, but they are special classes, namely the classes which are elements. Okay. And in a property logic, we can also distinguish between class-like properties, and set-like properties. Okay. And in Neumann-Berners-Gödel and in Morse-Kelley, we have also classes which are not elements, and they are called proper classes. Like, for instance, the universal class. The universal class is a proper class. This is not an element of any class. Okay. And in our property logic, we can also talk about set-like properties. We can talk about class-like properties. We can also talk about properly class-like properties. Okay. In this system of logic which we are creating here, we can have properly class-like properties, which are nevertheless instances of properly class-like properties. Because Ackermann is more liberal. So something like the universal class, for instance, can also be an element of another class. For instance, the universal class can be an element of the singleton of the universal class. So Ackermann is more liberal, and this is also what we need here. So now we have two comprehension axioms in this system, one comprehension system for class-like properties, and one comprehension system for set-like properties. Let's take, first of all, alpha asterisk. And I paraphrase this here, and after this paraphrase, you get the formalization. For any with alpha, which is only true of objects, and we will get to know what an object is, there is a property, A of alpha alpha, so being a Y such that A of alpha, whose instances are exactly the objects X such that A of X. And this is formalized below. If for all X, A of X implies OX, OX means X an object, then for all X, X is an instance of A of Y, Y. This is practically A-ness, one can say, if and only if A of X, where X is free for Y and A and vice versa. And O of X, read X as an object, is defined by means of the primitive monadic predicates S and U. So these are primitive predicates. They are not defined anymore in terms of simpler predicates. And O of X, if and only if SX or UX. So something is an object if and only if it is either a set-like property or it's an Urelement. SX and UX translate into X is set-like and X is an Urelement, respectively. And A of Y denotes the width in which Y is free. Note also that it is not the case here that all instances of class-like properties are objects. So if something is an instance of a class-like property, it can also be a properly class-like property, because we have something like V element of singleton of V, and we have now also property analogs for that in the Ackermann set, in this Ackermann-like system. Then we have a beta asterisk, a comprehension for set-like properties for any with A0Y, in which the predicate O does not occur, in which y is free and in which all free variables other than y denote objects, and which has the further property that a0 of y is only true of objects, there exists a set-like property, being a y such that a0 of y, whose instances are exactly those objects u such that a0 of u. This is very difficult. We don't need this axiom actually in what I have to demonstrate further on. But I just want to show it here. So this is the formalization. And in this formalization, x1 up to xn are here the free variables in a0 of y apart from y. And the antecedent ox1 and up to n oxn is obsolete if there are no other free variables in a0 of y apart from y. Then we can take the next slide with only two more axioms. Gamma asterisk, the axiom of heredity. If x is a set-like property and y is an instance of x, or all instances of y are instances of x, then y is an object. This is the formalization. And if we translate this into set theory, it means something like this. Yeah? In the Ackermann set theory, we have the axiom which states if x is a set, yeah, and y is an element of x, or y is a subset of x, then y is also an object. Yeah? Okay. So we don't require that something which is an element of class-like property has to be a set-like property. But if a class-like property is an element of a set-like property, then it's also set-like. Okay. Then we have delta asterisk, the axiom of foundation. If x is a set-like property which has instances, then x has an instance y, such that x and y have no instance in common. And this is given here. This is the axiom of foundation, which excludes that something can happen like that a property is an instance of itself, for instance. Actually, this is not assumed by all Navier-Nyakas. There are Navier-Nyakas who think that some properties can be an instance of themselves, which looks a little bit strange, first of all, but if you think about nameability, for instance, nameability is also nameable. Yeah? Why should nameability not be an instance of itself? But if you have this axiom of foundation, this is excluded. And most Navier-Nyakas would actually say that we must have something like foundation. Okay, this is actually explicitly stated by some Navier-Nyakas. They say that something cannot occur in itself. But actually, in my recent book, I studied a Navier-Nyakas who does assume something like this. Anyway, in this system here, we need the axiom of foundation, or rather the property analog to it, because otherwise we cannot prove the existence of something like nameability-ness, and so on and so on. If you want to prove the existence of these things, then you have to have this axiom here. This was shown in an article by Ward many years ago, a very complicated one. Actually, it's not easy to show that in this Ackermann system, we have something like classes of proper classes. Yeah? It's not easy to show it, but one can prove it, actually. And in order to do it, we need something like the axiom of foundation. So then we can take the next slide. Although our property theoretic adaptation of the Ackermann set theory with Ur-elements admits the existence of properties whose instances are properly class-like, a term of the form being an A such that A of Y, or A-ness, will be understood here in the sense of being an object Y, such that A is true of Y. And this corresponds to what Frankel, Bailel, and Levy also say about class terms like the class of all X, such that A of X. This should be read as the class of all sets at X, such that A of X. Okay. So whenever we come across such a property term, A of Y, this should be understood in the sense of being an object Y, such that Y is true of A. So now how can we formalize mutual absences and relational absences, or absences and differences? Although our property-theoretic adaptation of the Ackermann set theory with Ur-elements admits the existence of properties whose instances are properly class-like, we had this already. This is the next one now. Yeah. This is... yeah, this is one. Now, how can we formalize mutual and relational absences? Following B-law, names property operators after their corresponding first-order operators, both types of absence can be regarded as the result of negating a property term. What is the most obvious relation between fness, being in X such that Fx, and being in X such that X is non-F? As before, the second is the negation of the first. Normally, we talk about negations only of whiffs, but here we can also talk about negations of properties. And being in X such that non-Fx is the negation of being in X such that Fx. We can take the next slide. So this term, being in X such that non-Fx, may serve as a formal representation of the mutual absence of, that is, of the difference from an F, which makes sense. Difference from an F means being in X such that non-Fx. So this is the difference from an F, more accurately from anything which is an F. And the indefinite article has been added here in front of F in order to facilitate a smooth English translation. In Sanskrit, there is no article. A phrase like the mutual absence of a piece of cloth is commonly expressed by means of a compound, pata anyonya abhava, and the literal meaning would be cloth mutual absence. So keep this in mind, how we formalize mutual absences. Non-Fxx, being X such that X is not an F, this is the difference from an F. So we can take the next slide. Similarly, the relational absence of a pot would be rendered as a compound, which literally translates into pot relational absence, gata sangsarga abhava. When asked to specify the absentees, the so-called counterpositives, strategogin of these absences, a Navyanayaka might say cloth, pata, and pot, gata, where cloth and pot are usually meant in the sense of expressions which refer to any piece of cloth or any pot respectively. So in the case of the difference from a cloth, cloth is the counterpositive of this difference. In the case of the absence of a pot, pot is the counterpositive of this absence. Counterpositive is pratiyogan in Sanskrit. Then we can take the next slide. This is 34. One can regard the next one is 34. Yeah, in order to emphasize that no reference to one particular pot or piece of cloth is intended, a Navyanayaka might say that in these cases the counterpositiveness is limited, avachinna, by clothness or potness respectively. On the other hand, by adding a demonstrative like this etat in front of cloth or pot, he might indicate that these expressions are meant in the sense of singular terms. So when we want to talk about the absence of any pot, one can specify this also in this way. One can say the counterpositiveness, the absentiness is limited by potness. But when you want to talk about the absence of a specific pot, we can also say that it's the absence of etat matter. This is this pot. Then it's clear that we talk about the absence of one specific pot. Okay. Can take the next slide. No, this is not it. It's now 35. It's the next one. Yeah, this is the one. And one can regard non-fxx as a shorthand version, so this was the difference from an f, as a shorthand version of the following formalization, which duly mirrors the fact that Navya-Nayakas conceive of a mutual absence, that is, of a difference, as a denial of an identity between the absentee and the locus of the absence. We have this here. This formula, dagger, this term dagger, is just the same as the one which we have here in the first line, being an x such that non-fx. It's just the same. It's also obvious. But if we use this more complicated version, it's clear that a difference is somehow a negation of an identity. Because if we read it, we get being an x such that x is not identical to any f. Yeah. Okay. So this makes it clear. This is also a kind of support for my kind of formulation, because Navya-Nayakas say that such a difference is the denial of an identity. And we can see it clearly here. Then we can take the next slide. Now, relational absence. What is this? Notes one before, it's 36 now. Yeah. The relational absence of an f, more accurately of anything which is an f, can be construed as a property which characterizes something as being devoid of or no locus of anything which is an f. And this property will be formalized here by means of the dyadic predicate L, with the intent meaning is a locus of. And L is supposed to be a more general occurrence relation than the delta relation, in the sense that xly might also be true if y is an urelement. Thus, one can infer xly from x delta y, but not vice versa. For x delta y, this makes only sense if y is a property term. Yeah? Okay, this is how we understood delta. L is more general. If we say xly, then y might also be something like a pot or a mountain. Yeah. The mountain might be a locus of a fire, for instance. And this can be expressed by means of xly. We cannot express this by means of x delta y, because for x delta y, y has to be a property term. Okay. So then we can take the next one. Yeah, this one. Using the L relation for the purpose of formalizing a relational absence is appropriate in cases where there is no specification of the occurrence relation, which fails to subsist between the absentee and the locus of the absence. Now, we have said that normally when we talk about absence, we should also specify the relation whereby the absentee fails to occur in the locus of the absence. But sometimes the Navya-Nayakas don't do this. They just talk about the absence of pot, something like that. Okay, and then we can formalize this by means of the L relation. Thus, an unspecified relation absence can be formalized in the following way. This is double dagger, and read this as being x such that there is no y, such that y is an f, and x the locus of y. And this means something like being an x such that x is no locus of an f. This is also how we can understand this. It makes good sense to say this is the absence of an f. Okay. And if the relation absence is more specifically meant in the sense of a relation absence via contact or adherence and so on, one can replace L by the corresponding symbols for these relations, such as, for instance, C for contact or I for inherence. Okay. So then we can take the next slide. Let's now compare this 38, what we need, 38, yeah. Let's now compare these two formalizations which we have found. Since the present formalization of relational absences has basically the same syntactic structure as a mutual absence, namely not phi xx, where phi x is just there is a y such that fy and xly, one can also regard a relation absence as a negation, that is, as the negation of the property being a locus of an f, which can be formalized like this, being an x such that there is a y, such that y is f and x ly. This is being a locus of an f. And the negation of that is just the absence of an f. And since an absence has this general structure, not phi x, it's actually also a difference. And this makes good sense, because possessing a relational absence of an f means to be different from a locus of an f. So a relational absence turns out to be a special case of a mutual absence, and both can be regarded as negations. So now the next one, this is 39. Navya-Nayakas see the essential difference between the two types of absence in the relation by which the absentee fails to reside in the locus of the absence. In the case of mutual absence, this relation is identity. In the case of relational absence, it is some kind of occurrence relation. And this distinctive feature is duly mirrored in the present formalizations dagger and double dagger, because they differ only with respect to the relations L and is identical. So that's what distinguishes them. If you look back if we go back to slide, first of all, slide 37. Yeah, this one. No, the one before. Yeah, this one. Yeah. So there we have the L relation. This is the formalization for relational absences. And then we go back, further back to slide 35. Yeah, this one. Yeah. There you see, instead of L, the formalization for mutual absences. Instead of L, we have the identity. Yeah? So that's what distinguishes the two. Okay. And of course, instead of using a dagger, we can also just use the formalization which is given in the first line, being x such that x is not f. Okay. This is also very nice. This is a confirmation of my formalization techniques here. So then we can go to slide 40. Yeah, this one. In the literature on Navya-Nyaya, absences are occasionally referred to as a special type of relations. An absence is a relation relating a location conceived of by means of reference to a certain property, and a counterpositive conceived of by reference to another. For example, pot absence floor, PAF, where A is absence on. I quote this here from Phillips. The pot absence is located on the floor, known by its property of floorhood, and the pot that is absence is the counterpositive, pratiyogen, known by its property of being a pot, which is in turn specified as a particular pot or pots in general. So Phillips thinks that absences are relations. He says it in the beginning. An absence is a relation. Okay. And this is not mirrored in my formalizations. According to my formalizations, absences are properties. Let's go to the next slide. However, it seems appropriate to issue a caveat against the view that absences are relations. As Ingalls once pointed out, absence is not a relational abstract. Following Mahesha Chandra, we should rather say that absences are somehow like relations. Sambandhavat, this is what he says in his book, Brief Notes. They are somehow like relations since they pertain to a pair of individuals, namely an absential adjunct, the absentee or pratiyogen, and a subjunct, the locus of the absence. An absence is an absence of something somewhere. However, Navya-Nayakas normally do not talk about an absence without specifying the absentee. I quote here from Matilal, an absence is a property. As a property is necessarily dependent upon a counterpositive. This feature of dependence upon a counterpositive is urged by Gangesha as the necessary character of an absence. Next slide. An absence needs to be complemented with an absentee in order to serve as a qualifier which distinguishes a qualificant from other individuals. By contrast, the relation biological fatherhood, for example, qualifies only individuals who have fathered a child. The relation causeness qualifies only objects which are not causally inert. However, an absence by itself does not qualify anything, because everything is different from something, and everything is the locus of some relational absence. If an absence is complemented with a specific absentee, it becomes a non-relational property. Hence, our formalization by means of a property term of the form square brackets x seems appropriate. So, we can take the next slide. A reduction rule for the absence of a difference. Most Navya-Nyayikas endorse the following reduction rule. We call it AD. The absence of the difference from an F is Fness. Yeah? AD because absence and difference. Yeah? We have the absence of the difference. According to AD, the Navya-Nyaya counterpart of Apoha is identical to the property pertaining to all and only individuals which are singled out by the exclusion from others. We need not understand Fness here in the narrow sense of a placeholder name for universals. The result for the reduction stated in AD can also be an imposed property, like Pugnus, for instance, which is not a universal. So we can take the next slide. AD needs to be distinguished from the weaker claim that the equated properties in AD share the same loci, that is, that they are equilocatable, which is entirely uncontroversial. Differences were assumed to be related to their loci via the so-called self-linking relation. We have said this. So we may understand that the absence of the difference from an F as an absence whose absentee, that is the difference from an F, is unrelated to a locus in the sense that it has no self-linking relation to that locus. But no matter in what way we specify the relation here, the difference from an F is always absent from every F, since every F is not different from some F. So the absence of the difference from an F resides in every F. On the other hand, every F is a locus of Fness. So it's totally uncontroversial that the absence of the difference from an F and Fness share the same loci. Yeah? But this is something else to say now, that they are identical, these two properties. Let's take the next claim, the next slide. The stronger claim of the identity stated in AD was endorsed by the majority of Navya-Nyayikas. However, whether or not AD can be regarded as intuitively sound depends on one's choice of criteria for the identification of properties. It should not be overlooked that the Navya-Nyayika Raghunatha Shiromani would have rejected AD. His more rigid intuitions concerning the intentional character of properties committed him to take issue with the idea of reducing a negative entity to a positive entity. We will see that he actually raises the same kind of objection against another reduction rule. We can take the next slide. Now, how can we formalize AD, this reduction rule? The absence of the difference from an F is Fness. In order to formalize AD, we need to recall our formalizations of mutual absence and relational absence. Yeah? So we have it here again, non-Fx, x. This is the mutual absence or difference from an F. And there is no y, Fy and xlyx for the relational absence from an F. Now, what is the relational absence of the difference from an F? We get this if we take in the term for the relational absence, the second one here. If we take in this term, instead of Fy, y is F, just y is the difference from an F. And you see the result here in the middle of the slide. So when we do this replacement, then we get being an x such that there is no y. Y is the difference from an F, and xly, and x is a locus of y. And here we can further replace L with delta, since y refers now to a property term. Thus, we end up with this property term. This is a formal, this is on the last but one, in the last but one line here. This is a formal equivalent of the relational absence of the difference from an F. Then let's have the next slide. So then we can state this identity in a formal way as a theorem, which is done here in theorem in T1a. This identity, and in what follows, I give a formal proof of this by means of the axioms of T1a. And we have no time to run through all the lines here, but I can assure you it works. You get the result. There are two lines, asterisk and asterisk asterisk, 8 and 11, where you have to show a little bit more. Or to get these lines, I have to add some additional proofs. This is the next slide. So this proves asterisk. And then on the next slide, we have the proof of asterisk asterisk, and then we are done. We can take the next slide also. We have alternative combinations of the absences in Navya-Nyaya. We have talked about the relational absence of the difference from, but we can also talk about 2, the relational absence of the relational absence of. We can talk about the difference from the relational absence of, and we can talk about 4, the difference from the difference from. Okay. So, and can all these combinations also be reduced? That's the question. We have seen the first one can be reduced. The second one can also be reduced. But the third one and the fourth one cannot. And that's also why Navya-Nyayakas were not interested in them. And one can also clearly see why they are not reducible. Since we don't have much time left anymore, I will not show this anymore. It's also on my slides here, but we have to go on. So what is the reduction result for 1 and 2? So we move on to slide 52. No. Yeah, 53. 53. So what's the relational absence of the relational absence? As mentioned above, the reduction of 2 relational absences to the absentee of the second absence seems generally inadmissible. So I have argued about this on a previous slide. Navya-Nyayakas thought it's true. We can say the absence of an F is F, but that causes trouble. For instance, if we say the absence of Devadatta is Devadatta, then we have on the right side of the equation a human being. On the left side, we have an absence. The most we can say is that wherever there is Devadatta, there is also the absence of Devadatta, and also the other way around. But saying that the two are identical is a bit problematic. It's also problematic to say something like the absence of pot is pot. This is also something they say. But if we take pot here as an expression which refers to a plurality, to many pots. So pot is a common noun. It can refer to many pots. Then we have on the right side of the equation something which refers to many things. On the left side, we have the absence of pot, and this is just one single individual. It's a special absence. It's one individual. So this causes trouble. Nevertheless, many Navya-Nyayakas thought it's possible to say something like that. The absence of an F is F. I think one should discard it. Okay, one should discard it, but one can prove something else, namely this here. This is AA1. The relational absence of an F is the property of being a locus of an F. And this can be formally proved. And I do this here on the next slide. This is the proof. This is something one can show. So 2 absences can also be reduced, but to something else. The relational absence of an F is the property of being a locus of an F. Okay, this is proved here. Then we can take the next slide. Yeah. Some further results in a special case. The right side of AA1 can be further simplified. So AA1 was the absence of f is the property of being a locus of an f. In a special case, the right side can be further simplified. Let us assume that the expression an f in AI1 stands for an object which is identical to a of xx, where a of x is a width in which x is the only free variable. Then we can say the absence of being an x such that a of x is the property of being a locus of being an x such that a of x. This is what we had before already. But in this case, the right side can be further simplified, and then we get AA2. The absence of this property is actually the same as the absentee. So if the absentee of the absence of something, if the absentee here is a property term, then we can say the whole absence is reducible to the absentee. This can also be formally proved because we can prove PL. PL tells us the property of being a locus of anus is anus. So if we combine PL with this first one here, in the middle of the slide, the absence of anus is the property of being a locus of anus. If we combine this with PL, then we get AA2. The absence of anus is anus. And proving PL is also possible in T1A. This is on the next slide. We can't go through all this anymore, but I assure you it's provable. So then we can go to the next slide. Since a of x is an expression for an arbitrary width in which x is the only free variable, a of xx might be instantiated by a property term such as the relational absence of an f. Thus, according to AA2, three relational absences are identical to one. The relational absence of the relational absence of the relational absence of an f is the relational absence of an f. And it was mentioned above that the Navyanayaka Raghunatha Shiromani had misgivings about reducing a negative entity to a positive one. So AD, he didn't like that. The absence of the difference from an f is fness. Didn't like that. For that reason, he explicitly rejected also the reduction of two relational absences to the absentee of the second one, which most Navyanayakas assumed. He would probably also have taken issue with AD. Absence of difference is fness. However, he did endorse the reduction of three relational absences to one, what we have here in the middle, because then we have on both sides of the equation absences. So now slide 9, slide 58. Now, unfortunately, I've said this in the beginning already. Some Navyanayakas say that the absence of the difference from an f is fness, but it is also f. And this cannot be true because then fness would be f. So as mentioned above, AD was commonly accepted in Navyanaya. However, according to some Navyanayakas, there is good reason to regard the relational absence of the mutual absence of an f as identical to f instead of fness. Since they accept both identities, they ascribe a kind of double nature to the absence of the difference. And Maturanata's attempt to demonstrate that the relational absence of the mutual absence of an f is identical to f is rendered by Ingalls and also by Sideritz. Both authors don't see any glitch of the argument, and the argument runs like this. It's now on the next slide. So in the following formal representation of the argument, we basically stick to the notational conventions introduced by Ingalls and Sideritz. The dash means relational absence, the tilde means mutual absence, and C means counterpositive. So first line, Maturata says, absence of difference from x is difference from x. And he says this is true because he accepts also absence of x is x. This is problematic, as we have said already, but it's unproblematic if x is also a property term. We had this reduction with AA2. And here we have the absence of the difference from an x is the difference from an x. So this is okay. Because now, after the two absences, we get a difference. It's a property term. So one is okay, actually. Then Maturanata says the counterpositive of the first one is then also identical to the counterpositive of the second one. Okay, so counterpositive of absence of difference from X is identical to the counterpositive of the difference from X. And this is because we have one, and we have what Siderowitz calls the identity of counterpositive of identicals. So if two absences are identical, then Siderowitz thinks the counterpositives must also be identical, and he's wrong about that. We will see this. That's exactly the point where the argument breaks down. Then we take line 3, counterpositive of absence of difference from X is counterpositive is absence of difference from X. This is true. This is just by definition of counterpositive. 4 is also okay. The counterpositive of difference from X is X, by definition of counterpositive. Now we take line 3 and line 4 together with line 2. In line 2, we have an identity of two counterpositives. Line 3 and line 4 tell us what these counterpositives are. And then we get line 5. Absence of difference from X is X, and not Xness, as AD would force us to assume. So where's the mistake? The mistake can only be in line 2. And why is line 2 wrong? And we can take the next slide. We can even skip this one. We can take the next one. So in line 2, we have an identity between an absence and a difference. The absence of the difference from X is identical to the absence of the just a moment, is identical to the difference from an X. Okay. When we move back to the slide where we saw it. This was slide 59. So we have here in line 1, on the left side, we have an absence. On the right side, we have a difference. And this is important to note here. And now Siderowitz nevertheless claims that if these absences are identical, then the counterpositives should also be identical. But on the left side, we have then the counterpositive of an absence. On the right side, we have the counterpositive of a difference. And this is an important point. Now we move on to slide 61. Next one, okay. So it should be noted that in line 1 of the argument, the expression on the left side is an absence, while the expression on the right side is a difference. And here's a similar but simpler example of such a case. Absence of Xness is a difference from X. I call this identity sharp. Sharp is obviously correct. For instance, the absence of potness is identical to the difference from a pot. Okay. But the counterpositives on both sides of the equation are different. Xness is unequal to X. Siderowitz's principle of the identity of counterpositives of identicals is even problematic in the case of the identity of two absences. Consider, for example, Raghunatha's reduction of 3 absences to 1. This is flat, and we have seen this is valid. 3 absences X is identical to 1 absence X. This is valid. However, if we take the counterpositives, we get absence of X is X. And this can only be admitted if X is a property term. Otherwise, we get something like the absence of Devadatta as Devadatta. Okay. But for property terms, it's okay because we had this principle AA2. Okay. Then we get the conclusion. Next slide. 1. The Buddhist apoha theory is a way to explain the relation between word and meaning nominalistically, namely by means of 2 negations which express an exclusion of others, anyapoha. The exclusion of all non-Fs is supposed to provide an explication of the meaning of a common noun F, thereby rendering the assumption of universals obsolete. 2. For the realist Navya-Nayakas, the referent of a common noun is a particular in combination with a universal which is instantiated by it. The 2 types of absences, namely mutual absence, also called difference, and relational absence, which are part of their system of ontological categories, function as the objective correlates of verbal negations. only one of the 4 possible combinations of these 2 absences can be regarded as a kind of Navya-Nyaya counterpart of apoha, namely the absence of a difference. Wherever this combination resides in all substrates of a universal Fness, it is arguably identical to Fness, the functional equivalent of apoha. Let's take the next one. On 3. In T1a, an extension of George Wheeler's property calculus T1, differences and absences can be appropriately formalized. The formal versions of the following identities are theorems in T1a. AD, the absence of the difference from an F is Fness. AA1, the absence of an F is identical to the property of being a locus of an F. PL, the property of being a locus of anus is anus. And AA2, the absence of anus is anus. And then let's take the next one, next slide. 4. If F is a common noun or a proper name, the identities AA asterisk and AAD asterisk, the absence of an F is F, and the absence of the difference from an F is F, are rather counterintuitive. Since the left side denotes a single individual, namely the referent of a proper term, while the right side refers to a plurality or to an individual which belongs to a different ontological category. So F might be a common noun like pot, yeah? Then it makes no sense. If F is a proper name like Devadatta, it makes also no sense. Although AA asterisk was generally endorsed in Navya-Nyaya, it should be given up in favor of the provable reduction rules AA1 and AA2, which we had before. And Maturanatha's argument for the double nature of the apoha-like absence of a difference, which ensues from accepting both AD and AD prime and AD asterisk, this is based on the mistaken assumption of the identity of counterpositives of identical absences, yeah, which Sideritz buys, yeah, but Sideritz is absolutely wrong, as I can show. Okay, that's all I wanted to show.